What if one of K-pop's softest stars became unforgettable by making vulnerability look powerful? Before Jimin became the performer, people could recognize from a single movement, a single note, or a single expression, he was just a young boy carrying a dream that did not look easy from the beginning. Long before the sold-out stadiums, the polished image, the global fame, and the near-mythic presence he now holds on stage, there was a quieter life, one shaped by discipline, pressure, and the strange intensity of wanting something so deeply that it begins to define who you are before the world even knows your name. That is where Jimin's story becomes more powerful than people expect, because Jimin does not feel like someone who became memorable by accident. He feels like someone who turned sensitivity into skill, and skill into a kind of emotional force that audiences could never fully explain but could always feel. In an industry that often rewards boldness, dominance, and loud charisma, Jimin built something different. He made softness look sharp. He made grace feel dangerous, and he turned emotional openness into one of the strongest identities in modern K-pop. Born Park Jimin on October 13, 1995, in Busan, South Korea, Jimin's path towards stardom began far away from the scale of fame he would later carry. Before the world knew him as a member of BTS, he was a young student with a strong connection to movement and performance. That early relationship with dance mattered more than people realize. Because with Jimin, expression was never only about sound. It was about the body, the line, the emotion carried through motion. Even much later, when his image became global, that early foundation remained visible. You can still see it in the way he performs. Nothing about Jimin's stage presence feels random. There is always intention in it. The softness, the sharpness, the tension, the release, all of it feels lived through rather than simply practiced. And maybe that is because before he became famous, he was already learning how to communicate emotion through discipline, through repetition, through the difficult physical and mental work of becoming precise enough for art to look effortless. That kind of beginning shapes a person, because dreams built through discipline often carry a different weight than dreams built through fantasy alone. Jimin did not just want to perform. He was preparing himself for it, quietly, seriously, intensely, and that intensity would later become one of the hidden engines of his entire career. Still, none of that meant the road would be easy. To move toward the Korean idol system is to step into a world where talent alone is never enough. You are measured constantly, not only by skill, but by potential, presence, image, endurance, and how much pressure you can survive without breaking apart in public. For someone like Jimin, whose later image would be built around sensitivity and emotional depth, that world could have easily turned those qualities into vulnerabilities. Instead, they became part of his power. But at the beginning, that transformation had not happened yet. He was still a young person standing at the edge of a system much bigger than himself, carrying ability, ambition, and no guarantee that any of it would be enough. He had not yet become the idol people would later describe as magnetic, elegant, heartbreaking, or impossible to ignore. He had only just started moving toward that version of himself, and the next chapter would test everything. Because once Jimin left the safety of being only a student with promise and stepped into the trainee world, he would no longer be judged on what he could become someday. He would be judged on whether softness could survive the making of a star. Once Jimin entered the trainee system, sensitivity stopped being something beautiful and started becoming something risky. This was the stage where raw ability had to survive pressure, and where every strength could also become a weakness if it was not sharpened fast enough. In the K-pop system, especially for someone preparing to debut in a major group, talent alone is never the whole story. You are judged on discipline, consistency, image, adaptability, and whether you can keep going while being compared, corrected, and watched at every step. For Jimin, that meant entering a world where softness could easily have been crushed. But it wasn't. And that is one of the most important parts of his story, because Jimin's appeal was never built on looking untouchable. Even early on, there was something emotionally open about him. He did not carry himself like someone trying to dominate the room through force. He carried himself like someone feeling everything inside it. In a less demanding environment, that might have remained just personality. Inside trainee life, it had to become discipline. That transformation was not small. Jimin had to train not only to improve, but to survive. The idol system does not reward beauty of intention. It rewards results. Every movement has to become cleaner. Every weakness becomes visible. Every delay in improvement feels dangerous. For someone whose later image would feel so fluid and graceful, those years were likely far more brutal than the finished performances suggest. What looks effortless on stage is usually built through exhaustion no audience ever sees. And with Jimin, that hidden work mattered. Because what would later make him so magnetic was not simply natural charm. It was the tension between control and emotion. He learned how to refine movement without losing feeling. He learned how to make softness look precise instead of fragile. He learned how to carry intensity without making it look loud. That balance would later become one of the defining qualities of his entire image. Then came BTS. And with BTS, the pressure change scale immediately. This was not a quiet debut. This was the beginning of a group that would eventually reshape global pop culture. But in the early days, that future was not yet guaranteed. What existed instead was pressure, risk, and the need for every member to justify his place. In a lineup full of strong personalities, distinct tones, and different kinds of charisma, Jimin had to find a way to stand out without abandoning what made him himself. He did that through presence. Jimin did not become unforgettable by trying to overpower everyone else. He became unforgettable because the moment he moved, people felt something. His dancing had emotion in it. His voice carried ache. His expressions created tension. He brought a quality to BTS that was not only visual or technical, he brought feeling. In a group that already had scale and energy, Jimin added vulnerability, elegance, and emotional heat. That made him essential. Because great groups are not built only on power, they are built on contrast. And Jimin became one of the emotional centers of that contrast. He could feel delicate and dangerous at the same time, which made his presence unusually compelling. Audiences were not just impressed by him, they were affected by him. By this point, he was no longer simply a trainee who had survived. He was becoming one of the most emotionally recognizable figures in K-pop, and the next stage of his story would make that even clearer. Because once the world began truly noticing what made Jimin different, the challenge would no longer be standing out inside BTS. It would be proving that softness itself could become one of the strongest forms of power on the global stage. Then came the stage where Jimin stopped feeling like just one member of BTS and started feeling like an emotional language of his own. By this point, people already knew he was different. They knew the movement, the voice, the unusual mix of delicacy and intensity that made his performances impossible to fully compare to anyone else. But what changed the conversation was that Jimin's appeal was no longer just about standing out inside a legendary group. It was about the fact that he had created a presence people could identify almost instantly, even outside the scale of BTS itself. That is a rare thing, because many idols become famous through the power of the group around them. Far fewer develop an identity so specific that a single glance, a single turn, a single note, or a single expression can immediately feel like them. Jimin became that kind of artist. He did not just perform choreography, he gave movement emotion. He did not just sing melodies. He gave them ache, softness, and tension. He did not simply appear on stage, he changed the emotional atmosphere of it. That is what made him unforgettable. What audiences responded to was not only technical skill, though he had that. It was the way he made performance feel personal. Jimin never seemed to dance as if he were only completing a routine. He danced like he was translating feeling into motion. There was always something vulnerable in the precision, something sharp inside the grace. That contradiction became one of the strongest parts of his image. He looked soft, but he never felt weak, and that distinction mattered more and more as his fame grew. Because once people started truly seeing what he brought to BTS, their attachment deepened. Jimin was no longer simply admired for being talented or attractive. He was becoming the member many people described through emotion: heartbreaking, elegant, magnetic, comforting, dangerous, beautiful. He made people feel things they could not always explain, and that kind of connection is stronger than ordinary popularity. It creates loyalty. This was also the stage where his identity as an artist became clearer beyond group dynamics. The softness people first noticed in him was no longer read as fragility. It had become part of his power. He made vulnerability look deliberate. He made openness look controlled. He proved that gentleness could command just as much attention as aggression, and maybe even more when carried with enough honesty. That is why Jimin began to feel larger than the role people first gave him. He was no longer just the graceful one or the soft one. He had become one of the defining emotional forces of modern K-pop. And with that came a different kind of pressure. Because once the world starts attaching this much feeling to an artist, the expectations become heavier. People do not just want another performance. They want another emotional experience, another moment that feels personal enough to keep. By now, Jimin had already proven that softness could survive fame. The next question was whether he could turn that softness into something even bigger, a lasting legacy the world could not stop returning to. Now, Jimin stands in a place that feels almost impossible to separate from emotion itself. He is no longer simply a member of BTS, no longer only the performer people first noticed for his grace, his softness, or the way he seemed to move like feeling had taken physical form. He has become something much harder to define and much more powerful to carry, an emotional symbol. The kind of artist people do not just watch, but feel through. That is what makes him so unforgettable. Because Jimin's real power has never come from being the loudest person in the room. It comes from the fact that he can make softness feel intense, vulnerability feel controlled, and beauty feel almost dangerous. In an industry that often rewards force, he built influence through sensitivity. And instead of being broken by that sensitivity, he refined it until it became one of the strongest identities in modern K-pop. That is rare. It is also why his impact lasts beyond ordinary fame. A lot of stars become memorable because they dominate attention for a moment. Jimin became memorable because he gave people something deeper to attach to, a feeling, a mood, a kind of emotional honesty that seems to stay even after the music ends. People do not just admire him, they connect to him. And connection creates legacy. What makes his story so satisfying is that he never had to become harder, louder, or colder to be taken seriously. He did not erase softness to look powerful. He turned softness into power. He made delicacy look disciplined. He made openness look strong. And in doing that, he changed what power could look like on a stage that usually celebrates the opposite. Now, the question is no longer whether Jimin has influence. He clearly does. The more interesting question is what that influence will mean over time, because he still does not feel finished. He still feels like an artist whose emotional range can keep deepening, whose presence can keep evolving, and whose legacy may become even larger than the image people already hold of him. Some stars are remembered for their noise. Others are remembered for the way they made people feel. Jimin feels like the second kind. He turned movement into emotion, vulnerability into identity, and softness into one of the most powerful forms of presence in K-pop. That is why Jimin matters, not just because the world watched him, but because the world felt him.